Everybody. Welcome to the Neo4j Twitch channel. My name is Adam Cowley. And so today, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be switching up a little bit from the recent few streams. So previously, I've been doing some streams on some of the random things that I've been interested in that week. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch things up a little bit. I'm going to be building over the next few weeks a modern web application built with Neo4j under the hood. So right now there is a poll going on Twitter. So basically, I've got no roadmap, no project specification, nothing. So we're just going to make things up as we go along. So I've got a poll at the moment asking people what they would like to see. There's a few hours left on this poll, so if you haven't had your say yet, then feel free to head over and have your say. And I've also created a repository. So this will be where the code lives at some point. But for now, it's just empty. So if anybody would like to request any features, if there's anything they would like to see, anything that they're interested in, then feel free to head over there when there's some code inside there and then create an issue. If there's anything that you see that you think maybe a good addition that you'd like to build for yourself, or any experimentation you'd like to do, feel free to filter the repository and provide a pull request if necessary. But the technology that I will be using for this is firstly TypeScript. So I've been experimenting with TypeScript quite a lot recently, and it's something that I didn't like originally, but it's something that I'm really starting to like now. So essentially, TypeScript is JavaScript with an extra layer on top. So everything you build in TypeScript is compiled down into JavaScript. But what it does is it adds additional static type into the language, which means that you can pick up errors and problems before they even occur. So as you're writing the code, the IDE will pick that up for you. In terms of the framework that I'm going to be using, I'll be using NestJS. So NestJS is something that we're using internally inside Neo4j for a few projects. So the next version of Neo4j Desktop will be built in part with NestJS, and it's an opinionated framework for building server-side applications. So really, for me, this feels like the first real framework that I've used in Node.js or TypeScript in the few years that I've been using it. And the reason for that is it's got a lot of the modern features that other frameworks like Spring Boot and Laravel have inside them. It's mainly like the dependency injection. So I'll go into more detail about what the framework is, and we can code from there. So like I say, the poll hasn't finished yet, so feel free to have your say if there's anything that you would like to see. If you'd like to see something other than a subscription site, then feel free to shout out. But essentially all we want to do is just show off the features of Neo4j and how easy it is to integrate. So with this this poll not finishing yet, I think what I'll do today is I'll take the opportunity to show you how you can integrate Neo4j into an application. So essentially what I do today is going to be NestJS specific, but it's something that you can apply to all frameworks and all languages essentially. But in terms of NestJS itself, so it's a really great framework. The documentation is absolutely brilliant. I think it's one of the best pieces of documentation that I've seen in a long while. And so the framework itself is built around a few fundamental features. So, for example, we have things like controllers that you'd expect to see inside a web application, and then things like providers and modules, which I'll go through in more details. And the one thing that I'm really enjoying so far about the framework is the command line interface of the CLI. So you can install a CLI, and then essentially just helps you through the whole process, which is brilliant. So in order to install the framework, so the installation instructions are here. So we can run npm install, npm install global to install the CLI, and then this will give us a set of commands that we can run. Cool. So now that has that's run. So if we run nest-help, this will show us the kind of things that we can do. So that another thing I like about it as well is it's built for fast development. It seems like the developers are putting a lot of work into to making this a seamless experience. So for things, for example, like when you're creating a module, you can use module, or you can just use an alias as well, which is really great. So right now I've got an empty project. So just a README in there at the moment. So this will be pushed up at the end of the episode. So the first thing that we can do with the CLI is we can create a new project, and we do that using the nest new command. So I can say nest new, and then this will be the API inside the project. So I just call it API for now. So it will build the scaffolding for you and generate an example app for you. So I'm going to use npm. But essentially what this will do is it will create all the files, and then it will do the npm install and everything like that. Once that's done, everything is good to go. So while that is installing, I'll talk you through some of the things that get generated for you. So there's some TypeScript config and things like that. We're not going to go into any real detail about that at the moment. It doesn't matter too much what's inside there. In terms of the package.json itself, it's got a few scripts in there. So we're going to be using start::dev, and that just starts the server in watch mode. And then we can then go from there, and it will live reload as we make changes. There's testing built in as well, so when you create anything using the CLI, it will create the test for you as well, which is great. So it generates this source folder, and what this source folder gives you is a main.ts. So this is the main entry point of the NestJS application. So we have this bootstrap function there, which is an async function, which creates an instance of a Nest application using the Nest factory. And then it listens on port 3000 by default. One of the key pieces of functionality, or one of the key fundamentals of Nest is this concept of modules. So you can use modules to group your code into modules or into domains and subdomains. So the official documentation gives you an example of cats. So I won't go into too much detail about this. So it's docs.nestjs.com, and I definitely recommend going and reading this because it's really great documentation. But essentially, what this module does is it's a class which is annotated with the module annotation there, and essentially it defines a piece of code, or like an encapsulation of the different pieces of functionality. So in this case, it's all filtered around cats. It's all based around cats. So for example, we have this module. So it will register as one controller, which is the cats controller, which is the HTTP interface to the cats module, and then it provides one service, which is the cat service. And then, so for each one of these modules, what you do is you include it into the app module, so the main module, the one that we have at the moment, and then you would define that as an import. And then what this instructs the NestJS framework to do is to register that module, and then register any of the classes that it provides. So I'll go into more detail about what that is a little bit further on down the line. So essentially, you create modules, and those modules have services inside them, and then those services are essentially what interacts with this with a certain thing. Every one of the classes gets annotated with a if I go to providers, gets annotated with this injectable annotation. And essentially what that means is you can pass it into the constructor of any class, and then NestJS does some magic under the hood, and then it will magically resolve that class and then add it into the class you have at the moment. So this is great. This is a really good practice. It's great for testing because it means that instead of instantiating the whole project in order to test, you can mock certain features within a certain test, and then you can guarantee the returns come back, and then you can test based on certain use cases of the classes that you've imported. And also promotes the single responsibility as well. So it's a key responsibility in development. That any class should have one job and should do it well. So for example, if you have a cat service, and then any service or any module that uses that cat service should only be interested in the fact that, for example, a cat has been created, or maybe born would be a better example here, but it only cares that it's been created, doesn't care how it's been created. So, like I say, we're going to use this in terms with Neo4j. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to build a module for Neo4j, and then build some services inside those modules that we can then inject into services or controllers. Cool. So now this is installed. If I cd into the API directory, so you can see we've got everything there. And then the command tells you to run npm run start. So I'm going to run start:dev. So like I say, this is running it in watch mode. So essentially, if we make any changes, those will be automatically refreshed. So what I do is I run this inside in here. Oops, sorry, CP API. Cool. So essentially, what this is doing is it's finding the main script, so main.ts, and then it's running that. So we can see that from the logs, the Nest factory has started the Nest application, which is this bit here. App module has been installed. So this app module at the moment, which has an apps controller and an app service, and then we've mapped the get route from the controller, so this one here, and then the application is started successfully. So if I go to localhost 3000, so we now see that we've got hello world, which is this string here. So going back to the concept of dependency injection, what's happened here is because this is defined as an app service, and then the app service is then registered through the module, it means that this can then be injected in, and then there's some magic that happens there with Nest, which then ensures that gets set there. Normally what you would do is you would say, for example, that this.app service is app service, and then you could access it from there. But NestJS will do that for you, so you don't need to worry about that. Cool. So if we take a look at the app service, so this is a service which is injectable. It has a single function, which is get hello, and this returns a string. And then that string just returns hello world, which is what we have inside here, which is perfect. So if we say, for example, set the string to be hello Neo4j user, then we have that set there. So that as you make changes, everything will reload for you, which is great. So the first thing that we need to do to create a new module is to well, actually no. So first, what we need to do is we need to run the command to install the Neo4j driver. So we're going to use the Neo4j JavaScript driver. So this works with TypeScript. So like I said, TypeScript is JavaScript under the hood. So we'll run the install step to run this. So if I npm, if I seed into the API directory, and then npm install, and then we'll save the dependency in package.json and Neo4j driver. So the Neo4j driver is what we use to interact with Neo4j. So we create an instance of the driver, and again, this is the same with every language, with every framework. We have official drivers for 5 languages, and then we have the unofficial sort of community drivers as well. So we create an instance of the driver, and then through that we create sessions. So the session is essentially the high level abstraction and management of the connection pool between the driver and the Neo4j server. And then we can set the access mode, so that could be either read or write. So on a single instance of Neo4j, this isn't really too important. But when you get into a clustered environment, then all of the write queries go to the leader of the cluster, and then the reads will then get distributed across the cluster. So once we create that session, we then create a transaction, or we can use .run to create a transaction and run the query in the same step. So we'll be doing this today. So we send through a cipher query, which is a string, and then we can send an object as well, which is, in this case, the name param is Alice. So that refers to the $name param inside here, and that just means that that nobody can inject anything into your queries. And that's essentially that's what we need to do. So to follow the terminology of NestJS, what we're going to do is we're going to create a module. So that module will hold all of the we'll register the services that that our Neo4j interactions will use. And then what we do inside there is we will create a service which will then provide an instance of the Neo4j driver, and then will allow you to query the database. So, like I said, the command line tool is brilliant for Nest. So if I go to Nest help, I'll hide that for now. We've used the nest new command, but now we can use the nest generate command. And what this will allow us to do is just to create something. So, for example, we can create a new application, we can create a class, we can create some sort of configuration or a controller. So right now we want to create a module. So if I say nest, and then I can either use generate or I can just use G. So again, this is another great thing about Nest, is that it really cuts down the amount that you're typing. And then I want to create a module. So I can either type module, I can type mo, and then we'll call that Neo4j. Cool. So what this has done is it created a new file here, which is the Neo4j module.ts, and then it's updated the app module. So that app module now imports the Neo4j module, and then anything that's exported from the Neo4j module will then be available to all of the modules that are then imported into Nest, which is great, which will save us a lot of time as well, and a lot of scaffolding, really. Cool. So if we take a look at the module itself, there's nothing in there at the moment, which is too interesting. So we're going to build up on this. So we have this essentially what's a basic class, which is annotated with app module, which defines that it's a module. And yeah, so then we can create some methods inside there, and we can create some functionality. Cool. So at the same time, what we can do is we can use the command line to create the service. So in this case, we're looking for service or S, and then we'll call that the Neo4j service. And then what this does is it creates the service, which is annotated with injectable. So anything that has a variable injected into the, supplied in the constructor with a type of Neo4j service will resolve to this class. It also creates the spec. So this is the test suite. I won't go into testing too much today. Don't need to worry too much about that for now. And then it updates the Neo4j module to say that this will at some point provide the Neo4j service. Cool. So what we'd like this module to do and the service to do is to provide a connection to the Neo4j driver. So essentially what we need to do is firstly to create an instance of the Neo4j driver. So this takes two arguments. So the first one is a URI. So in this case, we're connecting to localhost using the Neo4j scheme. And then the second one is some sort of authentication method. So there are a few methods available. You can build your own methods, but the most basic one is sort of username and password. So you create this with Neo4j auth basic. So that's the first thing that we need to do. So we could just write some code inside the constructor here, and then we could create an instance of the driver, and we can inject that in. But that would mean hard coding the details, which obviously isn't ideal. So what we want to do instead, and because we're in TypeScript world, we can define the type of parameter that we're building in. We want to create an interface which will build up all of these details for us. So with that, we can use the generate interface method. So if I g, then there's no alias for interface, and then this is the Neo4j config. So this should just generate a single file for me, and see what it's done here. So it's taken the what's it called, slug case, and then converted that into upper camel case for the actual name of the interface. So this is just naming conventions that come with NestJS. So what we want to do is we want to essentially we want to build up these strings and these pieces of information. So the way that I like to do this is to split up the scheme and the URL. So what this will mean is that we can be specific about how the user should connect to Neo4j, and then when a user creates an application, we can do some validation on that. Or if somebody's using TypeScript and then they use the wrong scheme, for example, that if they spell something wrong, then we can pick that up actually at that point. So the first thing I'll do inside here is I will create an interface, and then I'll export that out. And we'll call that the Neo4j scheme. And this is a string, and it should be the different options we have are the Neo4j protocol. So this connects to a Neo4j instance or a cluster of Neo4j servers without any sort of security on there. We have Neo4j plus S, which is connecting to Neo4j with security built in. So that should be a type. And then we have Neo4j plus SCC, SSC. So this is connecting to Neo4j, but using a self-signed certificate. And then we have the same options, but for Bolt. Which will essentially just connect to directly to a single instance of Neo4j. That's cool. So the scheme should follow that. So it should be the Neo4j scheme. The host should be a string. The port should be, ideally it should be a number, but I mean it could be a string as well. It's going to be interpolated into a string anyway, so it's not too much of a problem. So the username should also be a string, and the password should be a string too. Cool. So for databases on Neo4j 4.0 and above, so since 4.0 we've introduced this concept of multi-database. So if you supply a database name to a session, then it will connect to a specific database. But otherwise, if you leave that blank, then it will connect to the default database. So that's defined inside neo4j.conf. So it's a dbms.default_database. So this will be an optional string. So we can denote that with the question mark there. And that's essentially all the information that we need to connect to Neo4j. Cool. So if we go back into the Neo4j module, what we need to do inside here is because we're supplying some sort of configuration, which the user can create a runtime, we can't just inject what's called a static module. So in this case, we'll have to create a function. So we create essentially a static function, which then returns what's called a dynamic module. So the naming conventions that are suggested by the NestJS documentation are, like, for example, register or root. So what we do is we'll follow those conventions, and we'll create a static function which is called forRoot. And then this will accept one piece of configuration or one parameter, which will be the config, and then that will be our Neo4j config. So that's imported in from that interface, and then this will return a dynamic module. Import it from there. So this is basically the same metadata that you would define up here in terms of the module itself is contained inside this this module metadata. So we have the imports, the controllers, providers, and exports. And then the additional information we have is the module. So it's the type of the class that the function will provide, and then global. So whether it's global or not. So when you create something in a global scope, it will be available to everything. Otherwise, you'll have to register it. Cool. So this will end up returning the dynamic module. So this is just an object really. So it will return a module. So that's the Neo4j module. And then so for the provides, so this will have an array. It will be an array, and this will provide the Neo4j service. Really good thing about TypeScript is because I had a spelling mistake there. it would highlight it straight away for me, so it tells me exactly what's going on, which is actually really useful. So yeah, so it's providers, not provides. So essentially what I could do now is I could, inside any other service or controller or any other class inside this this NestJS application, I can inject this this Neo4j service, which will then give me access to that. Cool. So if we take a look at the documentation for dynamic modules, so we can see here that we have sets of providers, and then the things that the module will export. So we should be adding that as a Neo4j service as well. Cool. So we can see here we've got this database module for root with this user, whichever this entity is. So what we want to do is first we want to register the Neo4j options, basically, because right now the Neo4j service doesn't have access to that configuration that we pass through. So what we need to do is we need to define that as something that would be injected in the module. Cool. So what we can do is we can create a new provider, and we can define it on the fly. And so then what we want to do is we want to provide something. So in this case, we're providing the Neo4j config, and then we want to, in this case, use the value of options. So this is saying that config. So for anything which has this Neo4j config injected in, then we will use that, or that value will be injected in instead. So I mean, this isn't really great practice. So what I'll do is I'll create a Neo4j constants, and then I will add that into there. So Neo4j config. String Neo4j config. Perfect. So now I can just import that in wherever I need to. So if I then change that to Neo4j config and then autocomplete, I can then import that in. So that saves me typing it and then changing that constant in many places. Cool, perfect. So now when we have for example, a class, so in this case, the service, in the constructor, I can use the @inject annotation to inject a variable, and this will be a config, which is Neo4j config. And this will be private and protected. We don't want anything to update this. Sorry, just private. Private read only is what we want. And then so this takes a single argument, which is a string, which is the target, and this will be our Neo4j config. So now, for example, if we have a get driver method, then we could return this.conf, or let's say get config, which returns Neo4j config. And then we could just return that config. So that's automatically and sort of magically mapped up from here. So I don't have to put this config equals config. Cool. So another thing that we should do really is so basically if the user supplies incorrect credentials, then we don't want the application to start and then to fail at a later place. We want that to fail early on in the application lifecycle. then stop the application from booting. So in order to do this, we use what's called an asynchronous provider, or an async provider. And these are basically async functions that return certain values. So in this case, also in the documentation, we have this, for example, like an async connection. So this is waiting for a connection to be created. So again, we'll define this in the same way, but we will define a new function for that. So inside the Neo4j module, we want to do is we want to add another provider in there. So this will be another constant. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to create an instance of the driver, and then we can use the verify connectivity function on the driver to make sure that it's been successful. So this will be the driver. So this will provide the Neo4j driver. And then this will then, so if we take the example, this will use a factory function, which should be an async function. And we will go from there. Cool. So what I'll do is I'll create a utils file, which I can just create some functions inside there, and they could be available across the whole application. Essentially, what I want to do is create a new function. So export const create driver equals. It's an async function. So what this will do is this will accept the Neo4j config. That's why. Cool. So we take the config in, then we'll create an instance of the driver, and then we'll go from there. So if I open up the Neo4j driver, take a look at that code. So we create an instance of the driver with the connection details and then the credentials. So we want a driver, which will be Neo4j driver. So equals Neo4j dot driver. So we need Neo4j there. So this takes two arguments. So it takes the URL, like I say, and then the auth token. So what we want to do is we want to concatenate together the details from that config. Cool. So we take a string there, and then we'll say we want it to be config.scheme :// config.host :config.port. And then for the username and password, we want neo4j.auth.basic. The username will be config.username, and then password is config.password. So that should give us an instance of the driver. Next thing we want to do is we want to verify the connectivity of that driver. So what you can say is await driver.verify connectivity, and then that will fail if it can't connect, and then before return in the driver. So with async config, which is Neo4j config, and then create the driver with the config. So that function will then return the value of create driver, which will then be our driver instance that we've created here. And then, so right now this doesn't have any context as to what the config is. So what we need to do is we need to include an inject, and that's an array. And then that defines the information that's then passed through to that function. So we want to pass through the Neo4j config, and then it will inject whichever or whatever value comes from this object, which should be Neo4j config, and then passes that through into the function. So the first argument of that function, and then that then creates the value. Cool. So in theory, now that driver's been defined, it can now be injected into any class in its own right, really. So by using the @inject annotation. So, but in that case, you know, we want to add some more useful methods to a Neo4j service to make it easier to read from Neo4j and to write to Neo4j. So what we want to do instead is we want to add this as a value in the into the Neo4j service, and then we can create the driver from there. So if I go into the service, so here I've got the config injected, but what I can also do is inject the Neo4j driver, and that'd be private read only driver. We'll import the in driver from Neo4j. So now what we can do is we can say, for example, get driver, which will return a driver. Return this.driver, which is, you know, may be handy, may be useful at some point. But really, what we want to do is we want to collect up all of the boilerplate that goes around running a query. So if I take another look at what we need to do for a query is first we create a session, and then we create use that session to run a query. So what we'll do is we'll wrap this. So instead of writing 2 lines of code, we're only writing 1 line of code in there. So for example, I can add a method for like to get a read session. So like I said, the sessions can be read or write. So get read session. So when you create a session, you can optionally supply a database. So this can either be it's either a string of one of the databases that exists in Neo4j, or if it's null or undefined, then it goes to the default database. So we can specify that as an optional parameter as a string, and then essentially all we need to do there is to return this.driver.session. So the session takes a single argument, which is the connection details. So we've got the default access mode, bookmarks, database size, etc. We don't really need to worry too much about that. So we can say that the database will be optionally the database that we supplied in. And because there's a database as part of this Neo4j config, it makes sense to fall back to that if necessary. So this means that the user can be specific about the database that they query. They can query the default database for the application, or they can just fall back to the database that's defined as the default in Neo4j.conf. So we can say this.config.database. And then for the type of the session, so we can set a default access mode. So if you create a transaction from this session, then it will override this, but just by default, it will route to the correct server. So on Neo4j, there is a session, and then that has 2 modes, which is either read or write. So in this case, read. We'll autocomplete is not my friend today. So you want to import Neo4j from Neo4j driver. Perfect. So that's the read session. So we can do exactly the same thing for the write session. The only difference is instead of session.read, it's session.write. Which is great. So if we recap this, so what I've done is I've got a module here, which I've defined, which accepts a Neo4j config object and then returns a dynamic module. So first thing we do is we register the config under this key or under this reference of Neo4j config, which uses the value of the config that the user has supplied. And then a second one, we're now using an async factory to then create an instance of the Neo4j driver and then ensure that it connects to Neo4j. So in this case, we're saying we're providing this driver into the function that we use. So inside this factory function, the argument that should be injected will be the Neo4j config, and then we can then call this function from here. That function then just creates a driver, which is an instance of the Neo4j driver. It calls driver.verify connectivity before returning the driver. Cool. So again, we've still got 2 lines of code that we can split down into 1 line of code. So when we actually run the query, as it stands, we'd have to call get read session or get write session, and then we'd have to then run the query from there. So what we can do is we can create another couple of methods. So one for reading from the database, and then one for writing to the database. So each of the calls take 2 parameters. So it takes firstly the query string and then a map of parameters. So we can say that the cipher is a string, and then the params is it's a record with the key type of string, and then the value is any. And then what we can do as well as this is to use the database that we pass through, and then use that to create the session. So you can either query against the default database, we can run against any database. And this will return a result, which is a type in Neo4j. So this holds the records, which is an array of this record, and then a result summary. So things like the amount of rows that returned, the amount of time that it's taken, a plan if there is one, etc. Cool. So we can say that a session is this dot get read session. Then we just want to do session.run with the cipher query and then the parameters. Cool. I'm going to add the database file as well. And then we want to return that. So then the underlying application doesn't need to worry too much about how that query is executed, but actually it matters. All that matters is that you get the results back, and the result follows this follows that contract. So we do the same for write. So we just change read for write. So if I check the console, there shouldn't be some errors there now. Okay, so it's saying to me that it can't resolve dependencies Neo4j service, something, and the Neo4j driver. Make sure that the argument Neo4j config index O is available in the Neo4j module context. Right, so there's something wrong in the configuration there somewhere. So a really nice thing about these errors, which is probably something that we're guilty of in Neo4j, is that it actually gives you potential solutions to the problem, which is really useful. Whereas some places just leave you with a really sort of ugly error message saying what's going on. So basically, it's saying that so if Neo4j config is a provider, is it part of the current module? Which is, it's fine. And if Neo4j config is exported from a separate module, is that module imported within Neo4j module? So a really good thing about doing this as a live stream, which is going to go on to YouTube, which by the way, it will go onto YouTube, is that I can just cut all this stuff out. It's perfect. But yeah, sorry for those who having to endure it. There we go. Right. So because it was a static module, it was trying to resolve this Neo4j service and all of the dependencies that were added into it. So these two, without actually having that Neo4j config defined. So that's only defined at runtime. So that's why that was not working. Okay, so now that's working. Everything's fine. Great. So we've got a service now where we can get the driver, we can get some config, we can create read and write sessions, and then we can actually read to the database right from the database. So to prove now that we can add this into any class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add it into the controller. So this app controller. So right now this uses the app service and then get hello. So right now it's saying hello Neo4j user. So what I can say in here is inside the constructor, I can inject the Neo4j service. So if I just do a console.log there, and this .neo4j service, and then if I refresh the page, so I've not actually registered that module yet. So it can't find the service because it's not registered. So the imports, it should be up there really. So what I need to do inside this array is, instead of importing it as a static module, I need to do import Neo4j module from root. So this is then using the method that we just built. So it should be in Neo4j config. So now in the app, so this should now give me the some sort of type hinting. Cool. So I should have the scheme I want to use is Neo4j. And again, this does all the auto completion for me, which is brilliant. So the host is localhost, and then the port is 7687. Username will be Neo4j, and then my password is Neo. So again, you probably want to move this into environment variables or something like that. But we won't worry about that too much for now. So now that I've added that dependency in, it's now registered the Neo4j service. So now everything is running. So if I refresh that, so it's hello Neo4j user again, and then if I look in the console, I can see that that's been logged out, which is great. So I've got this Neo4j service, which has got a config on it. It's got the driver on there. In the app service, I can say, for example, result is this .neo4j service .read, and I'll say like match n return count n as count. And I don't actually know what database I've got running, but I suppose we'll find out. And so we just supply that as empty for now. And then in order to get the result, all the rows, so on that result we've got a records array, and then we can basically do a for each row map on that. Because I'm only interested in the first one, I can say that the count is result.records. Oh, sorry, that should be an async function. I want to await that. Return a promise the string chords and the first one, and then .get count, because I've got return count n as count, and then we'll say there are count nodes in the database. Async. Is that going to work? No, so turn that into an async function, which returns a promise of string. Greeting is get hello. If I spell it right. Cool, so no errors, everything is fine. If I then refresh that page, so 1,038 nodes in the database. So we've achieved what we set out to do today. So we've now got this Neo4j module, which will be our interaction into Neo4j. It's defined as an app module. The Neo4j module then takes in some configuration, creates an instance of the driver, exports a Neo4j service, which then has some helpers there to allow you to interact with Neo4j. I've created this Twitch project, which I'll push the code up to in the next half an hour, an hour's time. If you have any suggestions of use cases, if you want to see any features, if there's anything you're really interested in seeing being built, then feel free to open up an issue there. If you'd like to take the code and fork it, make some changes, maybe even issue a pull request, then feel free. Otherwise, feel free to get in touch with me if you have any comments or suggestions. So I'm Adam Cowan on Twitter. My email is adam@neo4j.com, or you can join the Neo4j community site at community.neo4j.com.